My name is Gabriel Melendez, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at the University of New Mexico. I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Series, a partnership between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about New Mexico, the Greater Southwest as a region, and its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula. The La Canoa Legacy Series takes its inspiration from the word canoa. A canoa is a sloop-rigged fishing boat common in the Amazon, but in New Mexico it is the name of some common everyday tools, a simple canal or flute, or the wooden paddle a baker uses to move loaves of bread in and out of a hot oven. Always La Canoa receives and transports people and resources. And we want these talks to transport us and move the conversation between presenters and audience members back and forth in rich dialogue. We also want our talks to bring practical, useful information to community members, researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, politics, sociology, and religious experiences of our region.
Here's a short overview of what I'll be discussing. I want to talk a little bit about the history of colonialism, specifically settler colonialism in New Mexico. And then I'll discuss, I apologize ahead of time, I try to make really media-rich PowerPoint presentations when I present to large crowds, but because this is a rhetorical analysis and it focuses specifically on written documents and speeches, more like literature, it's going to be really text-heavy. But I'll be looking at some of William R. Ritch's and Al Bradford Prince's documents and specific statements that they've made in the 19th century. And then I will look at the state and the state of nuclear waste today. So not just the state of New Mexico, but also talking about the state of nuclear waste in the US. So as a quick overview, a lot of La Canoa's talks focus on the first two periods of colonization in the Southwest, and in New Mexico in particular. The first being Spanish colonization. In 1598, Juan de Oñate colonized northern New Mexico in the Rio Arriba County, what was then Yunque or Yunque-Owingue, which is present-day Oque-Owingue, formerly known as San Juan Pueblo. This actually plays a very fundamental role in what I'll be discussing in the nuclear colonization of New Mexico, because it's the same rhetoric of colonization that they used with Spanish colonization and taking over indigenous peoples and taking over indigenous land. The second period, major period in New Mexico was US colonization or American colonization. And we know that this really deals with the US-Mexico War. The US-Mexico War was the war between 1846 and 1848. And of course it ends with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which is when New Mexico entered the US as a territory. We know that it took New Mexico 74 years to become a state. And a lot of that, and I'll get into some of it today, but a lot of that had to do with the identity politics that were playing out in the state. You know, in the country, especially in the East, where they were making all the laws for the acquisition of these new territories, they didn't want New Mexico to become a state, in large part due to the Mexican population and indigenous peoples who were the majority of the population in New Mexico. A lot of you are nodding your heads because you know this history. This is familiar history to a lot of us. And so where I'm kind of departing from those earlier two periods of colonization is by looking at what I can consider the third major period of colonization in New Mexico, or settler colonialism, which is nuclear colonization. And I mark this in 1942, which is when the US government with Robert Oppenheimer, who was the head of the Manhattan Project at the time, took over a parcel of land in the Pajarito Plateau, which is in present-day Los Alamos. And earlier Patricia mentioned that I was from the Pojoaque Valley, and she mentioned this is where my research originated. So I grew up in the Pojoaque Valley in the town of El Rancho, small community, and my great-grandparents had a farm up on the Pajarito Plateau in Los Alamos. And so when the federal government came in, that was one of the properties that was taken by eminent domain to start the Manhattan Project. And so my early interest, and that's the first chapter of my book, but my early interest in this nuclear colonization was looking at that acquisition of land and how Hispanos were unlawfully dispossessed from that land, as well as indigenous peoples from the nearby pueblos. And so in 1942, the Manhattan Project takes over the Pajarito Plateau. In 1945, the first atomic bomb is tested in what is now known as the Trinity Test Site in southern New Mexico. And that was really, I hate that term, but it was the dawn of the nuclear era, right? And so my work looks at the effects of the nuclear industrial complex on people of color in New Mexico, because New Mexico is the only state in the US that has what we consider, or what we call, a cradle-to-grave nuclear industry. And so I'll get to that in a little bit later in my presentation. So again, I draw on the first two periods of colonization in New Mexico, Spanish colonization and American colonization, or US colonization, to talk about this third major period. So my work really starts in 1942 and then runs through present day. Literally right now, we already have dates for court hearings that are happening in January. So, let's see here. Don't restart, please. And so Patricia earlier mentioned that I teach a bunch of rando classes at UNM. The nice thing about being in the Honors College, and I actually used to teach for the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, but the nice thing about teaching in the Honors College is that we teach topics-based classes. And so I teach an atomic bomb culture class, but I also teach a class called The Legacy of Aztlán. And The Legacy of Aztlán looks at the myth of Aztlán and how it's turned into this concept, or this ideology, this ideological concept that continues to function in the American Southwest. And so for those of you who aren't very familiar with that term, let me give you a little bit of a background of it. So in 1885, William Ritch, who was a former, he served as territorial governor of New Mexico for a period. He actually served as all of the official capacities that anybody could serve during the territorial period of New Mexico. So he held a bunch of different positions, but his most prominent position was territorial governor. And in 1885, he published this book called Aztlán, History, Resources, and Attractions of the Territory of New Mexico and its Ancient Capital City of Santa Fe. And I put the full title there for a couple of reasons. One is it was not an error on my part. The acento is left off of Aztlán in the title of the book, and I think that's really significant for a reason I will come back to. But also because he claims that this book talks about the history, resources, and attractions. There's nothing about the people. That comes into play later when New Mexico is pushing for statehood. So New Mexico becomes a territory in 1848. Of course, California becomes a state soon after in 1850 because they found gold there, right? They needed California. They quickly made it a state. One of the articles of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said that all of these territories would become states as quickly as possible. We know that didn't happen. And New Mexico was one of the last states, New Mexico and Arizona, to be admitted as states. And part of the reason for that was because of who was living here, right? And so the conversation of who was living here fits into this really interestingly, because this is the period during which New Mexico was trying to make the argument for becoming a state. And so at the beginning of this book, and I was actually introduced to this book, which is now an archival document, it's not in circulation, but I was reading Ramon Gutierrez's article, which appears in another book called Aztlán. It's an edited collection. Rodolfo Naya was one of the main editors in that, as well as Enrique Lamadrid. And when I was reading Dr. Gutierrez's article in there, I realized, whoa, this is really interesting. This book seems to have a lot of rhetoric surrounding New Mexico as waste or wasteland. And so I said, I need to go find this book and I need to see what he's saying in there. And so whereas Dr. Gutierrez is really concerned with the myth of Montezuma that Ritch talks about in the book, I was actually more concerned with the rhetoric of inviting people from the Midwest and the East Coast to immigrate to New Mexico, to change the population, to push New Mexico to become a state. Does that make sense? And so at the very beginning of this book, he gives this myth of Montezuma. So some of you are probably familiar with the myth of Montezuma. The way that we know, most of us understand that myth, is that Montezuma was an indigenous leader in Mexico City in particular, when Cortez came in 1521 and colonized Mexico City, then called Tenochtitlan. And so when he colonized Mexico City, Montezuma was the leader of Tenochtitlan at that time, 1521 in Mexico. Well, what Ritch does is he totally transforms that myth. He recasts or resets that myth in New Mexico and recasts Montezuma as an indigenous person from a pueblo called Taguayo, which was an ancient pueblo, a pueblo that is no longer in existence, I should say, an indigenous homeland for Tewa-speaking peoples near Santa Fe. And he casts Malinche, who is the interpreter for Cortez, he casts her as a Zuni Pueblo woman. So by recasting this myth and reframing this myth in New Mexico, he's reifying that individualism that people from the Midwest and East Coast really wanted to promote at that time. So they didn't want this communist, that word was floating around, New Mexico is communist, because it was brought up by Adolf Bandelier as he was looking at all these archaeological digs of Pueblo peoples in New Mexico. And so they were trying to combat this idea that New Mexico was communal, as we know we have been for years and years and years, Hispano communities, indigenous communities, etc. And so he really wanted to promote this individualist idea in the 1800s. And so when this book comes out, he starts with that story. And of course, we know that that was problematic from the beginning, because anybody who studied history, the archaeologists, the sociologists, the historians say, no, Montezuma was not from New Mexico, and I'll come back to that shortly. But the remainder of the book is what really interests me. The remainder of the book poses or frames New Mexico as this land of unlimited resources. And of course, that framing of New Mexico as a land of unlimited resources, in particular mining resources, is very akin to the rhetoric that was used during the Spanish colonial era, when the Spanish conquistadores were writing back to Spain saying, there are unlimited resources here. This is the myth of El Dorado. This is, the 7 cities of Cibola. And so the rhetoric that runs throughout this book is really reminiscent of the same type of rhetoric that the Spaniards were writing back to Spain with in the 16th century. And so I want to jump into a little bit of the analysis of some of the quotes that he has in here. Up until this time, and actually throughout this time, New Mexico was really, like I've said, pushing for statehood. And so they had to make this argument. And the argument that actually existed before this switch, which actually comes in, Ritch was one of the big players, Bradford Prince was the other big player. The big switch really comes in with the publication of this book. Up to that point, people from the Midwest and the East Coast were considering New Mexico as uninhabited, as this wasteland, this barren wasteland. They were using, and in fact, even in this book, he refers to indigenous peoples as hostile, as violent. He never refers to the Spanish as conquistadores in this book. He totally elides the violence that the conquistadores enacted on indigenous peoples and indigenous communities in New Mexico during the 16th century, and instead he calls them pioneers. So all throughout this book, he refers to the Spanish as pioneers, 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 and then similarly, he refers to the people who he's trying to encourage to immigrate to New Mexico as you pioneers, you pioneers, you pioneers. So one thing I left out is leading up to this publication, and the publication was in 1885. That date is not wrong, I'll come back. Prior to that publication, New Mexico actually starts the New Mexico Bureau of Immigration in the year 1880. And it's really interesting when you just, to do a whole analysis of the Bureau of Immigration today, would be a fascinating project for somebody because of everything that's happening around immigration right now, right? With the Trump administration and the border wall especially. But the Bureau of Immigration was started in 1880 not to prevent people from immigrating, especially, indigenous people, people of color, but it was actually created to invite white or Anglo-Americans, Euro-Americans from the Midwest and the East Coast to come to New Mexico. And so in particular, in 1880, they defined their mission as to prepare and disseminate accurate information as to the soil, climate, resources, production, and business of New Mexico, with special reference to its opportunities for development, and the inducements and advantages which it presents to desirable immigration and for the investment of capital. So this was a capitalist endeavor from the very beginning. And so when Ritch produces this book or publishes this book in 1885, it was produced by the Bureau of Immigration. And actually Ritch, one thing I haven't mentioned is he wrote the original Blue Book. So Attractions of New Mexico was what this was called before it was called Aztlán. And again, he uses the myth of Aztlán to kind of change that rhetoric, but the Bureau of Immigration is what puts forward Ritch's book in the beginning. So one of the things that's published at the end of this book or two things that are published. There are two speeches that Ritch presented in 1883 that appear at the end of this book. One of them, and actually, the unfortunate part about this is that I can't see my notes on the bottom, so that's too bad. So I don't have the full title of that speech, but there was a speech that he gave in 1883, and it was presented, it was called the Tertio Millennial, I'm forgetting the full name now, Tertio Millennial Convention. So essentially it was a group of rich, white business owners and politicians essentially who had put together this organization to celebrate the 300-year anniversary of New Mexico. And they invited Ritch as a presenter to give two of those talks, one leading up to the event and then one during the celebration of the event. And so this 1883 speech that appears at the end of the Aztlán book was one of the speeches from one of those events. And he writes, "The brave pioneers from Spain discovered the country and rendered its settlement possible. The no less brave pioneers from east of the Mississippi made possible what we behold today. You are the pioneers of the greater future. May the glory of your achievements as much exceed theirs as a locomotive exceeds a carreta or a Winchester rifle excels the bow and arrow of an Indian." So again, we see this rhetoric of pioneering, of pioneers, and he really is inviting Euro-Americans to come to New Mexico. Again, the audience at this event was primarily Euro-Americans, Anglo-Americans, and so what's missing in all of these representations, there's actually one place in the book where he refers to Mexican-American people who were still calling themselves Mexicanos in 1885 as Hispano-Americans, E-S-P-A-N-O, which is really interesting. And so backing up a little bit, so again, he's using that rhetoric of pioneering. In the actual book, this is a quote from the main text of the book. He writes, "It must now be understood by those seeking in the year 1885 either wealth or homes in the territory of New Mexico, that they will find the same ready to hand for the taking or occupying, any more than Coronado in 1540 found gold and silver reduced, refined, and formulated, and within reach of the hand of the conqueror. Many and varied opportunities are to be found in New Mexico, as will be learned in these pages, for those willing to devote honest, intelligent, and persistent effort to the acquiring of a competency. No section of the country presents superior opportunities for the capitalist or better promise to the laborer. The responsibility of success or failure necessarily rests with the individual." So again, here we see the myth of Coronado, and we see that idea that people were going to come here and make a profit, right? They were going to become capitalists. They were going to get rich off of New Mexico. There's another part to this analysis that I'm not going to talk about today, but I want to mention it just so you think I didn't miss it, which is that uranium mining plays a heavy role in this process as well. So I'm going to be focusing shortly on the nuclear waste, but also this is similar rhetoric that was used for uranium mining. And of course, uranium mining is what occupied indigenous lands, and they're still continuing to push it and push to reopen uranium mining in New Mexico, but it's left devastating results on indigenous people, specifically the Navajo Reservation and the pueblos of Laguna and in New Mexico. And so, but the other thing that's really interesting from this page is that the way he's framing or the way he's playing to the affect of Euro-Americans who he wants to come from the Midwest or the East Coast by calling them intelligent, by calling them, saying that they're persistent, honest. You know, he's giving them all of these characteristics that he's not giving Mexican Americans or indigenous peoples. He never really mentions Mexican Americans in that context. He continues to draw on that Spanish. You know, these are the guys that created the myth of Spanish identity, right? Ethnic identity, which was Bradford Prince, which I'll get back to, but. They didn't want to recognize that these were Mexican Americans, that these people had just been Mexicans just several years before. And so by pushing the Spanish myth, they were really playing to the fact that these were Euro-Americans. Come join your Euro-American brethren. But at the same time, he was slipping in these things like, if the responsibility of success or failure, in other words, the people who've been living here didn't know how to work with these resources, so we need you to come and make a profit off of them. And all the while, he continues to call indigenous people hostile and violent. I said this was text heavy, I'm sorry. This is another quote from the book. It will no doubt be interesting to not a few Will Home residents to know all about how it was done in New Mexico during the years of dreary frontier irresponsibility and dense isolation. Again, he's referring to Nuevo Mexicanos as being irresponsible. To be assured of the truth of the statement that the whirligig of time has finally brought annihilation of space through the agencies of steam and lightning, and that the consequent free immigration of superseding those halcyon days of pooling for the few in peonage, particular contracts and bedeviled land grants, and upon the inseparable dry rot arising from 1,000 miles of isolation for centuries, and the attending monopoly of class interest. This is an especially interesting quote for me for several different reasons. One, he's referring to the irresponsibility, which I just talked about, right, of Nuevo Mexicanos, of Mexican Americans and indigenous people. But also there's what do you call it, like a dig here at land grants, right, at land grant communities. We know that one of the biggest effects of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was that Mexican Americans, although they promised to uphold land grants, it didn't happen, right? And we continue to fight in New Mexico. We continue to fight those battles to maintain our land grants, both the Mercedes and the Ejidos. And so he really is taking a dig at the land grants by saying that they were the problem child, right? The bedeviled land grants. He also, the next part is really interesting, and this is, again, part of that characterization of New Mexico as wasteland, this dry rot arising from 1,000 miles of isolation for centuries. In other words, New Mexico has just been this dry rot of isolation. This is the same rhetoric that's used when the Trinity site was used for the explosion of the atomic bomb, right? Saying that it was remote and uninhabited, and of course we know that's not true. I actually sit on the advisory board for the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Community Consortium, and one of the things that we're trying to do right now is we're working to get New Mexico downwinders included as part of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, which was passed in 1999, which covers people who were downwind of Nevada test site and other atmospheric testing, but of course New Mexicans were left out of that. So again, that's a different chapter of the book, which I don't want to get into, but so that dry rot arising, the other part of that that's interesting is the isolation. So even though he's keying in on the isolation as like this remote and uninhabited area of New Mexico, isolation also comes into play later when we see the installation of the waste isolation pilot plant, which is WIP. And then General M.T. Thomas also offers, he was a general, an Army general, who also offers a section in the Aztlán book. So what Ritch actually does is after he finishes giving his tour of New Mexico vis-a-vis all of the mining opportunities, he invites some of his friends to give their opinions on different parts of the state or different opportunities. And Thomas actually writes, I believe this is the section on Doña Ana, and of course we didn't have the same county makeups as we have today. So the county that was then called Doña Ana is actually or I should say the area that is now Lea and Eddy County is what was once part of Doña Ana County. Does that make sense? So current day Lea and Eddy counties were then part of Doña Ana. So this is Thomas writing about Doña Ana, and he writes, until within a very short time, New Mexico has been comparatively unknown. The reason of this may be found in its isolation by reason of not having railroad communication. Another reason was that it was inhabited by another race of people who looked with disfavor upon strangers. No one had ever doubted the mineral wealth of New Mexico. Yeah, and so, they write throughout this book never actually wanting to confront the racism that they themselves were dealing with. So on the one hand, they were wanting to become a state. They were petitioning the U.S. government, the federal government, the Senate, etc., to become a state. But at the same time, like, they couldn't just come out and say we don't want to live with these people either, because they've made basically bad choices in the way they've dealt with New Mexico. And again, he refers to the isolation. So the longer analysis of this also talks about the the way that he's presenting New Mexico as a wasteland, that if all of you people come from the Midwest or the East Coast, you're going to essentially change this by starting up these mining corporations and creating all of this capital. So let me shift from Aztlán to another player. So that first speech from 1883, when Ritch got in front of that Tertio Millennial Committee and gave the speech, the chairman of that committee was Al Bradford Prince. Al Bradford Prince was another territorial governor of New Mexico. He's often considered the father of New Mexico statehood. He is the one who, not single-handedly, but we also give him credit, for lack of a better term, credit for creating that Spanish, the myth of Spanish identity, right? And so in 1892, and of course my notes aren't down there, but I think this was in a statement that he gave as territorial governor. It was like the 30th or 31st convention of the New Mexico territorial, let's see, 1590, 80, yeah, territorial government of New Mexico. And he writes, New Mexico is a land of dry and barren waste, where there is little agriculture and no horticulture, where attempts at mining have been attended by failure, and where nature has done almost nothing to attract or support a population. So one of the reasons why I pulled this quote for today is because, again, it paints that picture of New Mexico as wasteland. If everybody comes, we're going to change this. This is all foundational to getting to why we have nuclear waste in New Mexico, so bear with me. I'm starting to lose people, I think. And so Al Bradford Prince, from 1892 to 1893, switches his tune significantly. And so these are points of comparison. Whereas in 1892, he is really promoting New Mexico as wasteland, this barren land. In 1893, he writes, our citizens are mainly the descendants of the two great nations which insisted on the rights of the people in England under Magna Carta and drove the Moors out of Spain, that self-government should reign there. They are the children of the patriots who fought for the independence of the United States in 1776 and in Mexico from 1810 to 1821. Surely the sons of such sires must be capable of self-government, exclamation point.
This is the very next year.
Yeah, very next year. He completely recasts Nuevo Mexicanos, or Mexican Americans in New Mexico, to be no longer are they like not honest or not irresponsible, but now they're these descendants of these great Spanish people, right?
Did you find the rich ones? Has he needed to be reelected or something?
Oh, they're fascinating. One of the things that I found in the archives actually was, and if anybody knows anything about Miguel Otero, I haven't pulled him into this yet because I'm not quite sure what to do with him, but he was very good friends with these guys. And when William Ritch actually passed away, there's a really interesting, proclamation that Miguel Otero as governor wrote honoring Ritch, which fascinates me in and of itself. But, here we see him really starting to retrain Nuevo Mexicanos to think of themselves as Spanish, as these noble Spanish people. And so then that was from Claims to Statehood, which is an article that was actually published. Good thing I have the citation of that one there. Let's see. And then in 1903, we're getting closer to statehood, and he says one word. So he's pushing this. We are Spanish. The people here are Spanish. The word Latin keeps coming up. Never Mexican, never Mexican American. It just never appears. One of the things that they were pushing alongside of this, and there are lots of scholars who've written about this, is the fact that when the United States took New Mexico as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo at the end of the Mexican-American War, the majority of the population here was speaking Spanish, obviously, or indigenous languages. And as they continued, Prince and Ritch and all of these other folks, as they continued to write their petitions for statehood, they continued to say, we've started all of these schools, all of these different missionaries, these different churches have come in, they're teaching English. We have the Normal University, which is now New Mexico Highlands. We have all these normal schools, and they're teaching these people English. So in other words, they're no longer barbarians, right? We can train them to be civil. But in 1903, he writes, one word with regards to the name New Mexico, and this really interests me, which seems to be a bugbear to some Eastern minds. All kinds of propositions are made for a change, a favorite suggestion being Montezuma, for no conceivable reason, as there is not the slightest connection between the unfortunate Aztec sovereign and this section of country. So he totally checks his friend Ritch, who was back, I can't do the math that quickly, but 1885, 20-ish years, right, 18 years or so, was saying, this is, Montezuma was here, this is the myth, this is why you need to come here for all this individualism and this progress, right? And now Prince is saying Montezuma didn't exist here. Well, what's the switch? The switch has to do with the fact that they don't want these indigenous myths being related here, right? In the back of all of this, on the one hand, while they're trying to say these are good citizens, these Hispano-Americans, right? These Spanish Americans, these are good citizens. On the other hand, they continue to say, oh, and then there's these indigenous communities, right? Or Indian communities, which is what they were calling them. So again, we're seeing different levels of racism. What's happening is they're creating this political hierarchy and this racial hierarchy, which comes back into play today. So now everybody's like, well, is Montezuma from here or is he not? It doesn't really matter. The point is that they're contradicting themselves for the purpose of positioning Nuevo Mexicanos or Mexican Americans in New Mexico at the turn of the century in these really different places on the racial hierarchy. And this is, I think, the last quote I have. He writes, same here. I think it's the same. Oh, no, this is a speech he gave. This is a speech he gave on January 6th, 1903, which again is also the date that New Mexico ultimately becomes a state in 1912. So I think the date is pretty cool here. But this was a speech that was written into the documents that were presented for statehood for New Mexico and Arizona. So there were different speeches that appeared in here, and this was one of them by Prince. He writes, in every respect in which she controls her own destiny, New Mexico is improving and advancing. Her railroad development last year exceeded that of the whole Atlantic seaboard. The only obstacle is the continued territorial condition. That affects both immigration and financial development. Statehood will bring good government and rapid improvement. The people will feel that they are really American citizens and not aliens or servants. All this will enkindle ambitions. I should put my glasses back on. Stimulate enterprise and lead to a glorious future. It's really interesting at this point that he starts talking about alienation. He is invoking this idea of alienation that New Mexico residents at that time felt alienated from the government, from the U.S., I should say, right? This comes back into play with nuclear alienation, which is a term I use to refer to the way that people of color in New Mexico become simultaneously alienated from their home communities if they work for the federal government or part of the nuclear industry, and from the nuclear industry because they're still identifying as part of these home communities. And so the fact that he's already saying in 1903 that people are becoming or feeling alienated as they're not citizens of the state, when we start to consider, or when I start to consider the reasons why they don't feel like they're citizens of the state because of the nuclear industry, it's all here, right? So you see, basically what I'm doing then is I'm tracking these three periods. I track the way that these things happen in the Spanish colonial period and track the way they're happening in the American colonization or colonial period. And then that takes us to the nuclear period. So how does this all relate? This is a map that was produced by Nuclear Watch New Mexico, and it's fairly new, actually. I don't know if you all can see it pretty well, but this is part of the reason why we say that New Mexico has the cradle-to-grave nuclear industry. I won't explain too much on here. I am happy to talk about this all day, but not today. But I'll point out a couple of different things here. So right here, the Los Alamos lab is pointed out. It says birthplace of the atomic age, right? So this is the beginning of that cradle. This is where nuclear, well, the beginning, not quite the beginning. This is where in New Mexico the nuclear era started. But we also see the mines here, right? And so the mines are really the beginning of the cradle-to-grave nuclear industry because they have to have the uranium, and then they enrich it, and then they get plutonium, and this is what's used for to power the whole nuclear industry. A lot of people think that the mines in New Mexico were used to get the uranium that were used to build the Little Boy and Fat Man, right? But that's actually not true. Most of the uranium that was used during the Manhattan Project was brought from Canada or from South Africa, right? And so they had just barely began to mine in New Mexico or discover uranium in New Mexico, I should say, when the Manhattan Project was going on. And that was because of the vanadium mines that were here in New Mexico. And then we see the Trinity test site, which is where the first bomb was tested. And then we have all of these things happening down here, some of which actually don't yet exist. And so this is the part that I want to talk to in reference to waste in nuclear waste. There was an article that was published, I think it was 2017, in 16 or 17. No, actually I think this one was 2013 in Salon. And the title of the article was "Take Our Nuclear Waste, Please." And so John Heaton, in the chapter, I'm not going to do a lot of analysis of what he's been saying, but in the chapter, what I really do is I take these statements by Prince and Ritch, and then I pull in these statements that Heaton has made in the last 9-10 years and compare them all against each other. Heaton is the modern day Ritch or L. Bradford Prince. He is currently the head of the Eddy Energy Alliance, which is the organization that is behind most of this nuclear corridor in southeastern New Mexico. He is a former New Mexico representative, and he's also very, very involved in both the political and the economic communities in Carlsbad and southeastern New Mexico. And so I pulled this quote in particular for a couple of reasons, which I'll discuss. He says, "We're looking at a surface storage facility. We think it's an ideal site. 10 miles north of the WIP site, 40 miles from any population, seismically stable, very dry with no overhead traffic. We're America's nuclear corridor, and this is the next logical step to take." So obviously you can tell this comes after WIP. I'm not going to talk about WIP today. WIP is a whole nother discussion. WIP opened in 1999 after a lot of fighting.
You can make it more than 10 minutes.
Oh, I guess I could, huh? Hadn't noticed that before.
Yeah.
We won't be here 4 hours, I promise. And so after WIP, really what happens is once WIP was approved, with the help of Pete Domenici really framed this opportunity for the nuclear industry to come in and make this an opportune place to bring nuclear waste. If anybody's read Pete Domenici's memoir on this, or if anybody hasn't read, I should say, you should read it, because there are some really fascinating things in there about the way I think that he sold out New Mexico and New Mexicans. But one person, I recently got into a conversation with an anti-nuclear activist, and they kept telling me it's Domenici who came up with this nuclear corridor concept. And I have scoured. I can't find anywhere where Domenici's come up with that. It's not in the memoir. I'm tracing it actually at this point to Heaton. And this is one of the earlier places. This was the 2013 article, because this is one of the earlier places where he does this, or where he calls it the nuclear corridor. He also names these set of stipulations for these waste sites, which is also comparable to the way that the federal government in 1942 created the stipulations for bringing the Manhattan Project to New Mexico. And as my other book chapter talks about, New Mexico was not the prime location. Site Y, or the Pajarito Plateau, was not the prime location for the Manhattan Project. They actually had other locations that were better suitable based on those stipulations, one of them being Oak City, Utah. But Oak City, Utah would have meant that they would have displaced approximately 40 farming families who were white Mormon ranchers. And so this is really similar to the way that happens. And so one of the reasons I say that is because they've done all of these different studies. They, being the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at this point, have done all these studies to look at what is the best possible place to put nuclear waste in the US today. And once WIP was put in, then it just set the whole precedent, right? And for those of you who don't know, we don't have at this point in the United States a long-term plan for high-level nuclear waste, and I'll talk about the differences of the waste in a minute. At one point, they were pushing Yucca Mountain, but in 2010, President Obama shut that down. So there's not even a plan for where we're going to put the high-level nuclear waste at this point, except that these guys are trying to make one now. Oh, let's see. Okay. And so let's talk a little bit about New Mexico's nuclear corridor. What does this consist of? It consists of the waste isolation pilot plant, which has been in operation since 1999. It also consists of Urenco, which is a reprocessing facility in that same area, which opened. It really started in like 2006, but it wasn't approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission until 2010. And so these two sites are active right now, okay? But now there are 3 new proposals. There's a proposal for the International Isotopes Inc., which is a depleted uranium deconversion site. And there's also the Holtec International proposal, which is a high storage CIS facility. I'll break these down in a minute. And then there's the proposal for the Waste Control Specialists, CISF, which is also a high-level waste facility. Currently, Waste Control Specialists is a low-level waste facility, but there is a proposal on the floor to make it a high-level waste facility, consolidated interim storage facility. This isn't necessarily in New Mexico, it's in Andrews, Texas. And those of you who don't know where Andrews is, it's basically New Mexico. Those of you from Amarillo are familiar with West Texas. Andrews sits approximately less than 30 miles from the border of New Mexico. So Eunice, which is where Urenco is, it's 31 miles from the Urenco site in Eunice. So this is the what Heaton's calling the nuclear corridor. I don't want to get too much into this. I just put this up here to remind myself to mention the differences between the 3. There's really 5 different types of nuclear waste, right? So there's low level, high level, and transuranic waste. Right now in New Mexico, we're dealing mainly with these 3 as I'm talking about these facilities. But there's 2 other facilities which New Mexico also houses. New Mexico, Albuquerque right now, and it's threatening our drinking water right now. Some of you are nodding because you know, right near about 5 miles from the airport, there's a 2.6 square mile mixed waste facility, or mixed waste dump, I should say. It's an unlined pit where starting in the 1950s, they started bringing waste from Hanford, which was in Washington, and other things that were happening, Sandia, Los Alamos, and in an unlined pit started dumping things in there. That's a whole nother conversation, but we have that. We're very close to it right here where we are today, 2.6 square miles. And then there's also the waste millings. And the waste millings are also in New Mexico because that's where the uranium mines are, right? So in terms of the low-level transuranic and high-level waste, WIP is the transuranic waste site. We right now don't have low-level waste or high-level waste sites. But the reason that I'm calling this the nuclear option is because of this comic that came out on Easter Sunday, April 16th, 2017, by John Trevor. Some of you probably know John Trevor, who's the cartoonist for the Journal. And I was looking at this, and it took me a really long time. First of all, I didn't know when he wrote Spent Uranium Processing, that's the Isotopes International. I wasn't even aware of that at this point. But the nuclear option is what caught me off, because when we hear that term, the nuclear option, as we've been hearing it in the news lately because of the Supreme Court nominations, right? The nuclear option is a term that was created, or a rule, an idea that was first proposed in 2003 by the Republicans, and they ended up not using it until 2004 when the Democrats took the majority in the Senate. And we know that the nuclear option is the rule now that allows the Senate to change from a 60 vote majority to a simple majority, right? That's how we ended up with Gorsuch, and that's how we ended up with Kavanaugh. Yeah, thanks. And so the more I thought about this, the more I thought, shoot, that's exactly what's happening here. It's a nuclear option, not because it's a 60-40 vote, but because of what is really environmental racism that's taking place here. And I won't read the whole thing, just this end. It's racial discrimination in the history of excluding people of color from the mainstream environmental groups, decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies. And so the more I started thinking about what's happening in southern New Mexico, and I started looking at who makes up southern New Mexico, I realized, shoot, the Eddy Lee Energy Alliance is made up of all white folks who have vested interests in these businesses. They're the same people who own the hotels in the city that are sitting in the boards that are making the proposals to bring these high-level and low-level waste facilities and reprocessing facilities to southern New Mexico. And so when you look at the makeup of Eddy and Lea counties, Lea County, 64.8% of the population identifies as people of color compared to the 35.8% who identify as white alone. In Eddy County, 53.4% of the population identifies as people of color. I also think, and actually really Lea County is a little higher, 16% of that population is foreign born. That's right on the border. We're talking once again of Mexican Mexicanos, right? Or Nuevo Mexicanos. And then 41.5% of speaking a language other than English, which is primarily Spanish in the household. So again, these guys are enacting these same rhetorics of colonization that were present in those first two periods. They're taking these minority populations, which in this case, New Mexico, we know, has a high majority minority population. They're taking these ideals and these values and these interests of the primarily Anglo communities, and they're leaving the people of color to deal with the results of these communities. These plants, these processing facilities, they have not been proven safe. That's why these have not been officially approved yet. That's a whole nother conversation that I don't want to get into today. I really wanted to just look at the rhetoric of how this colonization, this settler colonialism really is what it is made possible. But right now, like I said, these things are ongoing. So just this past few months, really, I think it was September, October, they're still in the process of trying to get these approved. These specifically, and I mean specifically Holtec. The other thing that's happening right now is that before Governor Martinez leaves office, she's trying to change WIP to be, what is the proper word here? It's to have it expanded, to expand WIP. And I say proper word because they can't really expand it. I mean, the original law says it could only house a certain amount of waste forever and ever and ever, and for up to 100,000 years, that's what it's set for. But the interesting thing with WIP is that it's only 55% full. So why are they trying to expand it? Well, they're trying to expand it because the other thing that's happening, there's all these things happening at the same time. The Trump administration is trying to change the definition of high-level waste. And so if they change the definition of high-level waste, all of these things that were once considered or that are currently considered high-level waste, the very, very dangerous high-level waste, if it gets reclassified as low-level waste, they'll be able to put some of it in WIP. And so what's happening in the background, all of these things are meeting in the middle kind of, and New Mexico is really being targeted as the site to bring all of this nuclear waste with a lot of threats and all of the threats that come with that. So I want to close with just a little bit of a call to action. Tuesday, December 4th, the Department of Energy granted a 30-day extension for public comments to change the definition of high-level waste. So if anyone wants to submit comments telling the government not to change that definition, that deadline is now January 9th of 2019. And also the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board will hear oral arguments regarding Holtec on January 24th, or 23rd rather, and 24th if they need it, here in Albuquerque at the U.S. Historic Courthouse. So this is, like I said, this is the problem with writing about contemporary historiographies. Oh, do you want me to go back? Contemporary historiographies is that all of these things are constantly changing, and so it's really hard to put an end on this book or an end on this chapter when literally tomorrow the definition of, not tomorrow, next month, the definition of high-level waste might change. And what that means for New Mexico is going to be really, really significant. I'll switch back to this in a minute, but I just wanted to end by putting a few more websites up here if anybody's interested in more information. These are organizations that I work with that are working really hard on all of these issues. MACE, Tewa Women United, TBDC, CCNS, SRIC, Beyond Nuclear, and NEARS.
Are you sure the last one's correct?
Yeah.
Nuclear information and information?
Oh, no. Nuclear information and, what is it, resource services?
Yeah, the acronym has an R.
Yeah, sorry, I messed that one up. And so this is, just to end, this is a picture of the proposed site for Holtec. These are the images that we're seeing. I took this image, but these are the images that we're seeing, remote and uninhabited area of southern New Mexico, when in reality, it's over 50% of people of color that are living in southeastern New Mexico.
Where's the picture taken?
Right at the beginning of the Holtec site.
No, but is it out near Anglo, or is it east of Anglo? Where in New Mexico
So
is that noticed?
It's between Carlsbad and Hobbs.
About halfway.
About halfway
okay.
between Carlsbad and
Where's the
Hobbs.
nearest town?
Carlsbad is actually
Oh, there's nothing
closest.
in between.
Yeah. But there's people traveling back and forth. I mean, there's all these concerns about trucking and shipping and the canisters and
But
stuff
they
that I don't have
totally
time.
ignored them when they put WIP in.
Yeah.
Right,
With
so we'll
the-
get to that in just a second.
What
Let's go
does
ahead
it
and let
say
Dr.
site
Gómez. Let's
anyway?
go ahead and let Dr. Gómez finish her comment.
So this is actually the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to let's take questions and talk about this. Yeah.
Right, and so yeah, let me just say, like, as somebody who grew up in a town called Bomb City, this is awesome to hear about. So you guys all have something to read in 2020 when the
Hopefully.
book comes out. Put it in your calendars. But yeah, so we'll go ahead and take questions and answer now. So please.
Go for it, Sonora.
Is it possible to do a book just ended like at 1903 or the statehood? You know, from 1848 to statehood to statehood, the things that happened in that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the range, the time range of my book has changed. I don't know how many times. First, I was looking at Manhattan Project. My dissertation was 1845 to 2005, I think. I don't know, and it keeps shifting. Yeah, it would be really easy to do this, but I just feel like this need to get as much of this in here as I can. You know, also, I want to open the doors. Like, I don't want to be the only one writing about this, right? I want so many people to pick up this work and continue the research. And so hopefully it's just a little bit of a start for somebody else. By the time the book will come out, who knows what's going to happen.
Break it into volume 1,
I-
volume 2.
Actually, somebody told me to do that. I was like, I don't know if I can work on this forever.
This is just a comment. I thought it was very interesting that the Bradford, I think it was Bradford, comment came out on the 6th of January.
Yeah.
And statehood was on the 6th of January. That is the epiphany. And I'm wondering if the date was chosen with a specific purpose.
Well, they certainly thought they were kings, so
Yes, they certainly did.
It's all about the money.
it is all about the money. Yeah, yeah.
Are there any documentations of like directives that went out to state agencies or whatever at that time frame, like education to start the English only program or things like that?
Yes.
Available?
Yeah, there are quite a few actually. Erlinda Gonzalez Berry has a really good article, which it's called "Which Language Will Our Children Speak?" Also, John Yanko Phillips' book, "The Language of Blood," talks about it. Yeah, it's a great one.
I have a question. In your book, are you mentioning how representatives are trying to push nuclear as renewable?
Yes. Yeah. So, and you and I know this conversation very well. This is such a complicated situation. New Mexico receives more federal funding than any other state. We have Sandia National Labs here, Los Alamos National Labs here, and numerous military bases, right? And because of that, our representatives, our congressional delegates, see themselves in a very provocative position, right? Because on the one hand, they don't want to stop the funding that is coming in for those entities, but on the other hand, we're not dealing with the results of what has been almost a 75-year legacy. Like, let's clean all those sites up first, and then we can talk about that, right? And so, but that doesn't answer your question. In terms of renewable energy, we know that nuclear is not renewable. All you have to do is set foot on any of those mining sites where indigenous land has been just absolutely devastated to see the effects of the nuclear industry, to know that it's not renewable. Those milling piles, and we've seen them, right, in Redwater Pond Road community, those tailing piles that are sitting there that continue to contaminate those people. Their hogans were made with the materials left over from those millings, and they're living in contaminated places. They don't have good drinking water, accessible drinking water, clean drinking water. And so while at the one hand we're pushing these capitalist projects, right? The other hand, we have significantly indigenous populations and Nuevo Mexicano populations suffering. All it takes is looking into any of these little communities. And part of the reason why I come up with this term nuclear alienation is because when all of these people in these communities of color, are working for these industries and they're paying them good money to work in these industries, then what do? You don't bite the hand that feeds you, right? So mom and dad and auntie and uncle and cousin and whomever have thyroid disease, have cancers, Hashimoto's, right? Or cancers, or all of these multiple sclerosis, all of these different diseases and cancers that are linked to radiation exposure. And we become complacent because it pays us good money, right? When I graduated, most of my community works in Los Alamos, and when I graduated from high school, I said, I'm never working for the labs. And in some ways, I feel like I didn't stray too far because I'm still doing similar work with this topic, right? But at the same time, like, I'm trying to raise this different awareness, and one of the things is, no, it's not renewable.
Maybe you partially moved into this, I want to make a comment, but also a question as to what part of your research deals with how people view, say, living with Los Alamos. Like, you know, what are the comments that are coming out of interviews, and what kinds of things have you found?
It's, like I said, it's complicated. There's a chapter in I think it's chapter 2. I've moved things around so much. I think it's chapter 2 now, that talks about the workers, right? So for instance, my grandfather was a laborer at the lab, at the Manhattan Project. He and all his brothers worked there as laborers. You know, my dad's cousin has told stories remembering how when her dad used to bring home the tools, they all remember. They would bring home tools, they would bring home clothes, whatever they would bring home in the 40s and 50s and use. And my grandpa and all of his brothers died of cancer. You know, and so there were also 3, what the chapter specifically deals with, that chapter, it deals with 3 explosives accidents that happened at Los Alamos in the 1950s. And just to kind of give a glimpse, in one of those accidents, there were no body parts that could be returned to the family. In another one of those accidents, body parts were not returned to or bodies were not returned to the families. And there's a gentleman that works at the lab by the name of Carrie, I'm forgetting Carrie's name now. Oh, I don't know why I can't think of his last name right now, but he just finished making a short film, and I actually worked with him on the project. And the purpose of the film was to bring awareness to those accidents. But the unfortunate part of it is it's a film that's used as a training video for the labs, and nobody outside of the labs can see it. And so there's all these, people definitely are talking, but these are conversations that happen like entre comillas, right? Like we're sitting at a dining room table saying, oh, so-and-so, this happened, and on film, when it's being recorded and when I put my recorder in front of people, they don't want to say anything. They put their jobs at risk. So it's complicated.
When my wife's uncle did all the furniture for Gómez, and she was saying the Chenets. And she was saying when they would play in all the waste dumps and the canyons and stuff.
Yeah.
Yep. Acid Canyon was a favorite place for the kids to play. There's actually, it was part of my dissertation, it's not going to be in the book, but there was a chapter on George L. Johnson. George L. Johnson was the first African-American chemist to work in Los Alamos in the 1950s. And because he was the first African-American, once the lab, it wasn't the lab at the time, but Los Alamos became public. They opened the gates, so to speak, in 1957. You know, the general public, Time magazine, everybody started doing all these articles on people. Well, Ebony and Jet magazines, 2 predominantly African or prominent African-American magazines, came in to do this story on George L. Johnson. And they took all of these images of his daughter playing, and sure enough, there's pictures in there of his daughter playing in Acid Canyon. And so these are really well documented, both in oral histories and in photographs of the children playing out there. People who ended up sick later, similar to what happened after the atomic bomb outside of Alamogordo. And really, it's not outside of Alamogordo. The closest town is really Socorro, or the closer community. But there's a woman who lives in California now who I know, and I actually had the opportunity to talk to her about this for the book. But they were at a dance, I think it was a dance camp, she and her friends, and when the bomb went off, there was all this white ash, right? Even though the federal government tells us that that didn't happen.
Yeah.
They bathed themselves in all this ash because, and Ken knows these stories too, they bathed themselves in all this ash because they thought it was snowing in July. And all of her friends except for her ended up with cancer, and all of them died. So, you know, those stories, these are the stories that I'm trying to capture in this book, right? The ways that this industry has affected New Mexico in ways that aren't being glorified. It's going to bring jobs to New Mexico. Yeah, New Mexico's poor, and we have all of these problems, but this is not going to fix all of our problems.
It'll make us mold.
And we have time for about 2 more questions and comments. Yes.
I'm thinking you might have to write another chapter this coming year too, now that we're backing off from any kind of nuclear arms control and talking about ramping up the production of ores in Los Alamos again.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. For a while, I got really obsessed with looking at Los Alamos' mission statement because on the website it kept changing so frequently. So when I started writing my dissertation, which was probably, 2011 or 2012, the original mission statement that I captured, and thank God I got it, because it originally said that the mission was to create nuclear weapons, right? Well, later when I went back, that had been removed from the mission, and it's not there if you look now. So on one hand, they're saying, we don't do that here. We're involved in all of this other technology. We're doing all this great biological research, which they are, right? But they just got approval to increase pit production at Los Alamos.
Yeah.
So they can't say that they're not still involved in making nuclear weapons if they're still producing pits. And also we have the munitions range here in Albuquerque, which was formerly the Manzano, right? Where we know that we still have nuclear weapons, and this is where Pantex comes into play, right? Because Pantex, all of these decommissioned nuclear weapons are being sent to Pantex to be decommissioned, and then what's happening? Well, all of that spent fuel is going to be sent back to New Mexico in these new facilities. So this is why we just become a really, really central, it's cradle to grave.
I wonder, you just mentioned some people clam up when they're on tape or when the camera's going. Have you talked to any of the retirees from the lab? Because I'll tell you why. My uncle was a photographer there for his whole career. He used to commute from Santa Fe to the lab and then fly out to Nevada quite often to photograph underground tests and such. But it relates back to some of the 19th century quotes that you gave, because I remember him telling me that there were these snide comments that the Nuevo Mexicanos would get, people working at the labs, such as saying, so show me your green card. And my uncle, being who he was and still is, pulled out his American Express card. This is my green card. So, I think there's a lot of that that carries over from some of those 19th century attitudes.
Yeah, no, that's a whole, yes, you're absolutely right on there. One of my favorite stories to tell, and I'm in the process of tracking down the specific documents, I've been looking for them for a long time now, which was that the lunchroom at Los Alamos was segregated. And the Hispanos and Nuevo Mexicanos got together and they went to Dennis Chavez, this was when Dennis Chavez was senator, and they went to Dennis Chavez and they said, if you don't figure out how to desegregate this lunch hall, blah, 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 blah. And so Dennis Chavez got brought in as part of that. And if we wouldn't have had Dennis Chavez and Senador, who knows what would have happened, right? There are so many stories like that. You mentioned about photographs, and I just want to add quickly that as I was working with Carrie on this project, and the person who was doing the film and the photography, and I said, he said, I can't find any pictures of Nuevo Mexicanos or indigenous people, yes, because it plays into that other side, the romanticized part of New Mexico, right? But Nuevo Mexicanos, no. He said, I have scoured that archive. I said, let's go back and look again. He said, Myrriah, I've scoured that archive. I cannot find one picture from the lab archives in those early years, 1950s era with Nuevo Mexicanos in them. You know where I found my grandfather's badge photo, actually? This is an interesting story. Was on a website one day. I was doing research and all of a sudden I open it and there's my grandpa's badge photo and his brother right next to him. And there were several people from our community in that set of badge pictures, right? But again, there's something to be said about these cards, badges being them.
Isn't that where the Española joke started? In Los
Marco
Alamos?
Polo, the Marco Polo one?
Yeah, the Española joke started in Los Alamos.
They said Polish jokes and changed them.
Yeah, Polish, but up in Los Alamos.
Oh, I see what you're saying,
Yeah.
the racist jokes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
racist
yeah.
jokes.
There's, yeah, I mean, that's obviously a whole another thing can be written about that. But you know, one thing, there are lots of stories, and these all appear in the book, like the time when Puaque played Los Alamos, and Española played Los Alamos, and Los Alamos was throwing tortillas on the court. Adán Baca has a poem called Beans that talks about that. The way that the mural was painted in the gym of Los Alamos of the hilltopper throwing a finger that had to be pointed and looking down. You know, it is a tacit geographic binary, but also a cultural and political and ideological, ethnic, racial hierarchy that's taking place there.
I think that's a perfect place
To stop?
No, just to end, so that would be ridiculous.